Welcome everyone. This is a sample lecture, a taster lecture to give you a feel of what it might be like to be an ancient history student here at Birmingham. And what I'm giving you today is actually based on a lecture I give to first year students in their very first week as an ancient history student at Birmingham. So it really is a taster of what it is actually like. So it's designed to give you a sense of what it will be like in terms of the teaching, but also the content. And I've started with an image which is close to my research interests, which is an image of Spartans being Spartan, but I'm not going to talk to you about Spartans almost at all today. So there's a lot you need to get through before you get to that. So today's lecture, like any ancient history lecture, will actually begin with a running order. So it's not a completely mysterious event about what we're actually going to talk about. I'm going to talk you through about what we're going to do today. So I'm going to look at the question of who were the Greeks. I'm going to consider where we might find the Greeks, and there'll be a moment of audience participation where I ask you to look at a map and tell me where you think Greeks might be found. We'll look at the idea of a polis. What is a polis? We'll look at how we actually know about the Greeks and how you as ancient history students are going to find out more about the ancient Greeks. We're going to look at the question of who is Herodotus. Quick show of hands, who's heard of Herodotus before? Okay, I've got some hands up, that's good. And we'll look at the question of what Herodotus was writing about, and we'll look at the really big question of how much can we as ancient historians, because now that we're in this room we really are ancient historians, how much can we trust Herodotus? Are we able to take him at his word, or are there reasons to be really cautious about what Herodotus tells us? So the big question, who were the Greeks? Well, bit of a problem for us. The Greeks weren't actually the Greeks. We call them the Greeks. They called themselves the Hellenes. And it's the same today in modern Greece. Greeks don't actually refer to themselves as Greeks, and they don't refer to their country as Greece either. That's our term for them. The Greeks called themselves Hellenes because they all believed that they were descended from one man named Hellen. And this is a moment where I always have to pause to first year students and say, a man named Hellen, with two L's, not one L. And occasionally I said an exam question that's something along the lines of, why did the Greeks call themselves Hellenes? And one of the potential options is because they were all descended from Helen of Troy. And that's definitely the wrong answer. They're all descended from Helen. And there's a wonderful passage in Herodotus where this idea of the Greeks all coming together with one culture is put into a sentence where an Athenian says, we're all Hellenes, one race speaking one language, with temples to the gods and religious rites in common, and with a common way of life. And so speaking the same language, having the same practices, that's what makes them Greek. And I've got an image from Larry Gonick's cartoon History of the Universe to put this the backstory to this idea in perspective. The Greeks believed that Helen was the sole human, was the son of the sole human Deucalion who survived a great flood. The Hebrew Bible is not the only ancient text which has a flood story in it. The ancient Greeks believed that the gods were angry with humans and decided to wipe them all out in a great flood, and one man survived, Deucalion, and he threw a rock over his shoulder, and his son Helen was born from the earth, and he is the first Greek, and all Greeks are descended from him. Where would we find Greeks in the ancient world? Is a question I throw at you now. And I have a map here which is blank. So this is a moment where we require some audience participation. Does anyone feel confident they could tell me where we would find Greeks? This is the moment where you're behaving genuinely like first year students in the very first lecture. You're all sitting there shyly. And you've even demonstrated that by not sitting in the front row as well, because no first year students sit in the front row if they can possibly avoid it. Anyone confident enough to suggest where they think Greeks would be found? Beginning, in the middle of the map, left or right? You're volunteering? To the right, okay. I think we're heading definitely to the right. If you were thinking there, are we now all grinning and agreeing with me here? Yep, you would definitely find ancient Greeks there, as you will find Greeks today. But that's not the only place in the ancient world you will find Greeks. You will also find Greeks in southern Italy and in Sicily. And it was really interesting this week. It was in The Guardian. There was an article talking about how in Sicily there's a town where they're selling houses for €1. And buried in that article was a fact where they said apparently this city was founded by Greeks. And they wrote it in such a way it made it sound like it was founded by Greeks in the last couple of years. What they were actually talking about was the period of colonization where ancient Greeks sailed around the Mediterranean and set up cities elsewhere. So you'll find Greeks in southern Italy and Sicily. You'll find Greeks along the coast of what is now Turkey as well. I'll come back to this issue later on. And Greeks at the time that our primary sources are talking about, and the time that I'm talking about today, tended to live in city-states, and the term that the ancient Greeks had for city-state was polis. And I'm going to try and explain that in map form for you here. So what's the most famous ancient Greek city anyone can think of? You're volunteering, yeah? Athens, yeah, okay, perfect. That was the right answer. So the city of Athens that you can travel to today has existed for thousands of years. The ancient Athenians actually believed they had always lived there. They believed their mythical kings like Helen had actually sprung up from the earth itself. So the Athenians were proud of the fact that they were indigenous and had never lived anywhere else. You've got another famous city that's a key part of my own work, Sparta, and just as another perspective for you, another city that some of you might have heard of, Corinth. So we're often thinking about these places as cities, but they're not just cities, they're city-states, and I'm going to show you that with this map. Now, Athens and Athenians, they didn't just live in that dot that is the city of Athens, they actually lived in all of that surrounding countryside. So that's what I mean by a polis or a city-state. It's the city and its surrounding countryside. The Spartans controlled all of this area known as Laconia, and they actually conquered the neighbours next door, the Messenians, and turned themselves into what is pretty much the biggest city-state in ancient Greek history. And just to illustrate the point a bit further, you've got Corinth there. These are actually three of the biggest city-states. A lot of the city-states are much smaller than that. So our sources often talk about Athens and Sparta, and they're often talking about Athens and Sparta just because they were bigger and more powerful than the rest of the cities. And these cities tended to get big. And one of the consequences of getting big was they started to spread themselves around other parts of the Mediterranean. So that map before where I was showing you southern Italy and Sicily, there are various colonies set up in the period between 800 and 500 BC. So you might think of the north coast of Egypt and Libya as very much African. But in the period that we're looking at today, it was actually colonized by the Greeks. The Spartans set up a colony in Thera, which is the modern island of Santorini. Those people, when they filled up Santorini, set up a colony in Cyrene in North Africa. You've got the colonies in Sicily and southern Italy, which modern scholars tend to refer to as Magna Graeca, Greater Greece. There was almost as much landmass controlled by Greeks there as there is in what we would think of as Greece. You've got Byzantium, founded around 600 BC. Byzantium, later known as Constantinople, now known as Istanbul. And my personal favourite when it comes to Greek colonisation, Massilia. You will know it more, it'll be much more familiar to you as Marseille. The French city of Marseille was actually founded by the Greeks, allegedly 598 BC. They're quite specific in some of these explanations of things later on, but it will have been around that time. And the Greeks can actually be found in the period we're looking at here, right up in the Black Sea coast, up in what is now disputed territory between Russia and Ukraine. So the Greeks got around quite a bit in the ancient world. I should actually point out, while I've got these slides up here, one of the things I like to do for first-year students is give them a timeline here. So as we progress downwards through Greek history, we actually get a sense of where we are. So in lectures that follow, I would actually have one of these, some of these year ranges highlighted so students get a sense of what's going on in terms of chronology. Okay, so how do we know about these Greeks? I'm telling you all these facts about Greek colonization. I'm talking about Greeks living in city-states, and that this was called a polis. And the big question then is, how do we know about them? And we know about them because around the time that I'm going to start talking about, the Greeks started to actually record their own history. And the word history actually comes from the first attempts to actually record the knowable past. And today we're going to focus on the first surviving historian, whose name is Herodotus, who is sometimes known as the father of history. And this is an image which is labelled as Herodotus and is what someone in the ancient world thought Herodotus looked like, but there's no real sense that this is actually really an image of Herodotus. And Herodotus set out at the very beginning of his work, he explained what he was trying to do. So his work begins with, here are presented the results of the inquiry carried out by Herodotus of Halicarnassus. The purpose is to prevent the traces of human events from being erased by time. So Herodotus said, I'm doing this inquiry, and the Greek word for inquiry is historia, which is where our word history comes from. It comes from the idea that Herodotus was examining, he was investigating, and he went around asking people what they could tell him about things that had happened in the past, and that's where our word history comes from. And Herodotus was worried that significant things would be forgotten if someone like him didn't record them. And the main thing he's actually talking about is the escalating conflict between the Greeks and the Persians that takes place between around 546 BC and 479 BC. But Herodotus tells us a lot of other exciting things as well. But the big problem we as historians have, because we are historians now, is that Herodotus has the reputation of not entirely telling the truth. Cicero, the Roman historian, a rhetorician, orator, described Herodotus as the father of lies, because Herodotus told a whole lot of stories that were untrue. And I'll give you a good example or two of some of the absolutely absurd Herodotus stories. Number one is in Book 3, Herodotus talks about giant gold-digging ants that you can find in the Middle East. He says, here in the desert there live amid the sand great ants, in size somewhat smaller than dogs, but bigger than foxes. Herodotus clearly sees some big dogs, but they've got these giant ants, and the Persian king has a number of them at his court, and when they are found in the wild, these giant ants make their dwellings underground, like Greek ants. They resemble them in shape, they're just massively bigger, and they throw up heaps of sand as they burrow, and the sand which they dig up is full of gold dust. So clearly this is just a complete lie. There is no way in the world that around 500 BC there were giant ants digging gold out of the ground in the Middle East that we just have somehow not heard of. So this is clearly a lie. And Herodotus tells us about some amazing sheep. Just a few passages later, he says there are two varieties of sheep that are worthy of wonder and occur nowhere else outside of Arabia. One of these has a long tail which is not less than 4.5 feet long. If this were allowed to just drag behind the sheep, they would actually be injured by it. So what some people do is actually they build a little cart which they can put on the tail of the sheep so it can drag it along. So giant ants that dig up gold and sheep with tails 4.5 foot long, even on a little cart. But it gets worse when Herodotus talks about actual historical events. Herodotus tells us the story of the Persian king Cambyses and his brother Smerdis. Herodotus tells us that Cyrus, the father of Cambyses and Smerdis, defeated Croesus, king of Lydia. He tells us that when Cyrus died, he was succeeded by Cambyses, who was mad. And then he goes into great detail explaining the career of Cambyses, which really follows a path from what he calls hubris, you could think of that as arrogance, right through to nemesis, the disaster. He's a wildly violent, arrogant man, and he dies the type of death that a wildly violent, arrogant man deserves. He talks about how in Egypt, Cambyses killed the sacred Apis bull. He secretly murdered his brother Smerdis because he was jealous of his brother, and then he died, coincidentally with a wound to the leg just where he'd wounded the Apis bull when he killed it. So it's the kind of thing that makes it very clear the gods want Cambyses to die. He then tells us that Persian priests, known as the Magi, took the opportunity to put an impostor on the throne. And weirdly, his name was Smerdis. He just happened to look like the other Smerdis as well, with one minor problem: he had no ears. But that's not a problem because Persian kings wear a cap that covers their heads, so you wouldn't know that the false Smerdis has no ears. But clearly, those who are close to the king might know. For example, one of his many wives might notice that he has no ears. And funnily enough, this is part of the story, because one of Smerdis's new wives, because ancient Near Eastern kings don't just have one wife, they have a whole harem of wives and concubines, she discovers that the Smerdis, who is allegedly the real Smerdis, has no ears, and tells her father Atanes, who is one of the Persian nobles. Herodotus then reports that a group of noblemen, including Atanes, overthrow the impostor Smerdis, and then its story gets even more strange, because he tells us that having got rid of the king, these 7 Persian noblemen sat down and have a great debate about how Persia should be ruled from now on. And they debate whether Persia should remain a monarchy, whether it should become an oligarchy where just a few powerful elite men rule Persia together, or whether they should become a democracy. And Herodotus pauses his history at that point in time and he says, I know you won't believe that this happened, but I can assure you it is true. And one of the reasons he has to pause his history and assure his readers at this point in time that this is true is because these events are taking place around 525 BC, which is about half a century before the Athenians, as far as they are concerned, invent democracy. So how could the Persians how could they debate whether Persia should become a democracy before anyone has even thought of it? So Herodotus' story is seeming slightly weird here. It then becomes very, very Greek stereotype about the Persians, because they debate about democracy. It's suggested as a wonderful idea. Everyone will have a say. It will all be fair and open, and this is rejected. And ultimately, the Persians decide that they should remain as a monarchy. And this really confirms Greek stereotypes about Persians. Persians are ruled by kings, so they're naturally servile. So when having the opportunity to decide about whether they should govern themselves or let just one man rule them, they just say, yeah, let's just have one man rule us. It tells you a lot about how the Greeks view themselves. They prize being free. They prize being able to have a say in the running of their state. Even the Spartans have an assembly of citizens who are able to vote on major decisions. The Persians do not. They choose to remain a monarchy, and this is where the story gets even more crazy. Herodotus tells us they decide it should be one of the 7 conspirators who should be king, and they will ride out into the countryside, and whoever's horse neighs first when the sun rises will become the king. So it's a great system in place here. Again, Greeks can be laughing at the Persians. The interesting thing about it is Herodotus gets quite detailed there. Darius wants to be king. He wants to ensure that he can be king, and he has a wily servant who says, I can make it happen. And his servant visits the stables, finds a mare who is in heat, rubs his hands on the mare who's in heat, gets scent on his hands, and then waits until the sun rises, and then puts his hand covered with the scent of the mare on heat in front of Darius' stallion, who neighs at sunrise, and Darius becomes king. So, as I put in the slide that I give the first year students, you couldn't make this up, could you? This is just complete nonsense. So, what does this leave us with? The obvious assumption is Herodotus is foolish. Herodotus is just telling us good stories. And when I was an undergraduate, this was pretty much how everyone viewed all three of these stories, just complete nonsense, the kind of thing that Herodotus does, earning himself the father of lies title. But here are some Arabian sheep. They're known as fat-tailed sheep. These are undoctored images. It's not a very good image, that one, but it's undoctored. These are pretty enormous tails. And this is a 6th century AD Roman mosaic from what is now Jordan. And you can see there was a pretty sizable tail on this sheep here. This is a early imperial Roman period oil lamp, which is showing a mythical scene. It's showing Odysseus escaping from the cave of Polyphemus from the Odyssey, hiding under a sheep. But the thing that's worth noting here is the tail of this sheep is pretty sizable. And here's a 7th century AD Middle Eastern Roman mosaic with an enormous tail here from a sheep again. And this is my favourite image. This is from a 17th century Dutch history of Ethiopia. They clearly read their Herodotus, and they have a fat-tailed sheep with a little cart under its tail. So it is actually entirely possible that Herodotus is exaggerating rather than in making up this story of the fat-tailed sheep. There are a variety of different fat-tailed sheep found in Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and other Middle Eastern countries. They have different sized tails which are pretty big. There's the Awassi breed, which has a beaver-shaped tail. There's the Karaman breed, which is 2/3 of the sheep in Turkey, so it's not just an obscure breed, which also has a beaver-shaped tail. And there's the Daglic sheep, which is prominent in west central Turkey, which has a more triangular tail. So on the sheep, Herodotus might have been more right than we think he was. Now, how about the giant ants? I assume we're pretty confident that this is a made-up story, but Herodotus might not have been entirely wrong. Wrong on the giant ants, not wrong on some of the other details. In the 1990s, a French ethnographer by the name of Michel Picel suggested that Herodotus was wrong about the ants, but right about the gold and a giant creature digging them up. He found, when he was in the Kashmir region, that it was the Himalayan marmots would dig big holes in the sand, and the local peoples would actually gather gold dust. And he goes on, and this is some Himalayan marmots actually digging in the dirt there. According to Picel, it was astonishing. There were marmots and the burrow and the piles of sand they had thrown up. And he then goes on to say, a landslide exposed darker gold-bearing soil 3 feet below the surface. That was the same soil the marmots had dug up from under the sand. So what's entirely possible here is that Herodotus has got confused about the word, and he was hearing about giant squirrels and heard it as giant ants. And who hasn't made that sort of mistake? You're laughing. I'm going to give you a good example. In March, I was in Athens. It was early in the morning. I desperately needed coffee. I didn't understand what the waiter said to me, and what I said to him was effectively, I'm sorry, I don't understand Greek coffee. What I actually meant to say was, I'm sorry, I don't understand Greek. But I said Elliniko instead of Ellinika. That sort of mistake is pretty easy to make when you're dealing with another language. So it's entirely possible that Herodotus just heard what was giant squirrel as giant ant. And then it gets even more interesting when you get to see Darius's version of how he came to be king. So you have Darius's message explained in monumental form. This is Darius's a document describing Darius's reign and how he came to be king. And I like this image for a variety of reasons. You've got Darius here. You can see he's a full head bigger than all of his subjects here. And his subjects here have been bad men. And you can see that in the fact that all of them have hands tied behind their back because they are being punished by Darius, and it's hard to see, but one of them in particular is actually underneath Darius's foot. He is stamping on one of his subjects who has done the wrong thing. And Darius is wanting everyone to know this, and I'm going to show you how he wants everyone to know this. This is his inscription. This is the message that we're going to be reading in a moment, and this is where it is. Darius wanted to leave this for people to find. The interesting thing about this was people didn't really find this inscription and understand what it said until the late 19th century. So there are generations over the years of scholars who've looked at Herodotus' story of how Darius became king and thought, well, that's just complete nonsense. But all of that changed when they read this story, because what Darius tells us is that he was the son of Cyrus, named Cambyses was king before him. That Cambyses had a brother named Smerdis. Afterwards, Cambyses slew Smerdis. When he slew Smerdis, it was not known by the Persian people that Smerdis was slain. And when he went into Egypt, where he will go on to kill the sacred bull, the sacred Apis bull, according to Herodotus, no one knew what had happened, and there was a rebellion. Darius goes on to say that rebellion was led by one of the Magi, known as Galmata. Galmata lied to the people, saying, I am Smerdis, the son of Cyrus, the brother of Cambyses. Galmata seized the kingdom on the 9th day of the month Galmapada in 522 BC. So Herodotus' story of a false Smerdis matches partly what Herodotus tells us. Darius goes on to report that he was one of a few noblemen, he doesn't give a precise number, he just says a few, who learned the truth, rose up against the false Smerdis, and rather than a devious servant coming up with a means of making his horse neigh first, it was the god and only god Ahura Mazda who made Darius king. So Herodotus' story matches elements of the official version of Darius' ascent to being the Persian king. So what does this actually tell us about Herodotus, this wonderful storyteller who tells us lies? Well, I think it's safe to say the giant ant story suggests that Herodotus wasn't a great linguist, but he was dealing with the whole of ancient Western Asia, so mistakes can be made. The story of Smerdis tells us that he is talking to the right people. That's the official Persian version of the ascent of Darius to king, but with some distortions. So he might be ripping yarns while getting the right story. So we have to be cautious, but there is some element of the truth in there. We also have to remember that when Herodotus is reporting stories that he's hearing from his informants, that many of the stories might have an element of, Daddy, what did you do in the war? And people are bigging themselves up. And Herodotus seems quite happy to report people's potential exaggerations of their own achievements in his account of what happened. And the other thing to remember is that Herodotus, for better or worse, is our main source for this sort of period of Greek history. So if we want to know what happened between the fall of the Mycenaeans and the Persian Wars, Herodotus is our most detailed and our best source. So for better or worse, we have to deal with him. And if you want to know more about that, you'll actually have to choose to come to study ancient history with us next year.